The lawyer's office smelled like old paper, and central heating turned up too high. 14 people sat in chairs that had been dragged in from other rooms, arranged in a rough horseshoe around a desk that wasn't big enough for what it was being asked to hold. Outside, a November wind pressed against the glass. Nobody spoke. They were all waiting for their name. Joanne Teller had been the one to drive her aunt to chemotherapy. She had been the one to sort the medications into the weekly pill organizer, to sit in the cold hospital corridor for hours reading magazines she had no interest in, to hold a thin hand during the nights when the pain got bad enough that sleep wouldn't come. She had done all of it without being asked. She had done all of it without expecting anything in return. She told herself that, quietly, as the lawyer began to read. The house on Birchwood Lane went to the eldest nephew. The savings account, substantial, carefully tended over decades, was split between two cousins who had visited perhaps twice a year. The good farmland, 60 rich acres on the eastern side of town, went to a man she barely knew, and then her name, Joanne Teller. A parcel of land at the northern boundary of town, 40 feet wide, 60 feet long, rocky soil, recorded value, negligible. She didn't move. She kept her face very still. Someone across the room coughed. Someone else shifted in their chair. She felt every single person in that horseshoe decide, in the same quiet moment, that she had gotten exactly what she deserved. Joanne was 53 years old, and had spent most of those years making herself useful to other people. She worked 4 days a week at a dental practice, managing appointments and insurance claims from a desk near the front window. She drove a 10-year-old car that ran well because she maintained it carefully. She lived alone in a rented house on the edge of town, kept a small garden, and never once described her life as lonely, though it sometimes was. Her aunt, Dorothy, had been the closest thing to a mother she had known since her own had passed when Joanne was 19. They had fallen into a quiet rhythm over the years, Sunday lunches, phone calls on Tuesday evenings, the kind of companionship that doesn't announce itself, but becomes, slowly and completely, load-bearing. When Dorothy was diagnosed, Joanne hadn't hesitated. She had restructured her entire life around the illness. 3 years of appointments, of prescriptions, of long drives and longer waits, of sitting beside a hospital bed watching a woman she loved become smaller and more fragile. Week by week, she had never asked what was in the will. It had genuinely never occurred to her that it mattered. She had done it because Dorothy mattered. Because loyalty, she had always believed, was not something you offered in expectation of return. Standing in that overheated office, she was beginning to understand that not everyone saw it that way. She drove out to see it on a Saturday morning, coffee going cold in the cup holder, her dog, Biscuit, restless in the back seat, with his nose pressed flat against the window. She hadn't told anyone she was going. There was nobody she particularly wanted standing beside her for this. The land was exactly as advertised. A narrow rectangle of earth wedged between a rusted fence line and a gravel road that didn't appear on most maps. The soil was pale and hard, threaded through with dry weeds and broken rock. A few scraggly trees leaned at the far end as though they had given up trying to grow straight. There was nothing here. There had probably never been anything here. Her cousin had called that morning to suggest she cut her losses. The family attorney had sent a brief, polite email the day before, noting that a developer had already expressed interest and that she could likely recover something, though not much if she moved quickly. Even the neighbor whose fence bordered the eastern edge had wandered over, looked at the ground, and slowly shaken his head without saying a word. Joanne stood in the middle of it and felt something quiet and stubborn settle in her chest. Biscuit jumped the fence and started digging immediately. She let him. By the third morning, Joanne had developed a routine. She would arrive just after 7, park on the gravel road, pull on her work gloves, and spend 2 hours clearing whatever she could before her back started complaining. Biscuit would patrol the perimeter, investigate smells, and generally supervise without contributing much. It was quiet work. She had started to find it calming. That morning, Biscuit didn't patrol. He went straight to the northeast corner of the plot and started digging before she had even put her gloves on. She called him off. He ignored her. She walked over and took him gently by the collar, pulling him back. He strained forward, whining low in his throat, his legs churning the moment she loosened her grip. She had never seen him like this, not frantic exactly, but locked onto something with a focus that didn't belong to a dog chasing a scent. She let him dig. 20 minutes later, the hole was nearly 18 inches deep. Biscuit had stopped digging and was simply standing at the edge. Staring down, breathing hard, Joanne crouched beside him and looked. Something was down there. Not rock. The color was wrong, the edges too deliberate. She reached in and brushed the soil away with her fingers. Slowly, the way you move when you don't want to be wrong about what you're seeing. Metal. Curved. A lid of some kind. She kept brushing. A container. Old and rusted and sealed completely shut, as though someone had placed it there with every intention of it never being found. It took her 20 minutes and a flathead screwdriver from the car to break the seal. The rust had fused the lid so completely that she half expected to find nothing useful inside. Water damage, rot, decades of slow destruction. She almost prepared herself for that. What she found instead was a bundle of documents wrapped tightly in oilcloth, dry and intact, preserved with a deliberateness that made her breath catch. Whoever had sealed this container hadn't done it carelessly. They had done it the way you pack something you intend to last. She didn't unfold anything, not out there, not in the wind with dirt on her hands. She photographed each layer carefully with her phone before touching it, the way she had once seen someone do on a television program about archaeological finds. Then she carried everything to her car, laid it across the passenger seat, and sat for a long moment looking at it. Biscuit rested his chin on the center console and watched her. That night, at her kitchen table, with a pot of tea going cold beside her, she began to read. There were deeds, old ones, the paper soft as fabric, the ink faded but legible. There were letters in a handwriting she almost recognized. There was a hand-drawn map, careful and precise, marking locations she couldn't yet identify. And running through all of it, appearing in the deeds and in the letters and in 2 places on the map, was a single name, Dorothy Calloway, her aunt, the woman who had left her a worthless strip of dirt. Joanne set the papers down and stared at the wall. There was a man named Gerald Fitch, who had worked for 30 years as the county archivist, and who, according to the woman at the local historical society, knew more about land records in this part of the state than anyone still living. Joanne called him on a Tuesday. By Thursday, she was sitting across from him in a cluttered back office that smelled like dust and old binding glue. The documents spread carefully between them on a felt mat he had laid out without being asked. Gerald didn't speak for a long time. He moved through the papers slowly, holding certain pages closer to the light, occasionally reaching for a magnifying glass he kept in his breast pocket. Joanne watched his expression and tried to read it. What he told her, carefully and without drama, rearranged everything she thought she understood. Decades ago, before the town had grown outward and filled in its edges, a water access easement had been established running directly beneath the northern boundary plots. It was a legitimate legal instrument, properly recorded, and then somewhere in the late 1970s quietly and deliberately removed from the active registry. Not lost, not misfiled, removed. Gerald had seen it done before, he said. It happened when someone with enough local influence decided that a particular piece of information was more valuable buried than visible. The easement rights, he explained, had never actually expired. They had simply been hidden. Someone in Joanne's family had known this. The documents in that oilcloth bundle were proof, original proof, the kind that predated the erasure. Whoever had buried that container hadn't done it out of ignorance. They had done it because they were afraid of what knowing meant. The offer arrived on a Friday morning, typed on clean letterhead from a company called Vantage Land Solutions. It was formal, politely worded, and specific. A number that was higher than anything the family attorney had mentioned, but still far below what Joanne was beginning to suspect the land might actually be worth. What unsettled her wasn't the amount. It was the timing. She had spoken to Gerald Fitch 4 days ago. She had told nobody else. That same afternoon, her cousin Russell called. He didn't ask how she was. He opened with the land, casually, the way you bring up something you've been thinking about for longer than you're admitting. He said the family felt she was getting in over her head. He said there were legal complexities she didn't understand. He said the sensible thing, the practical thing, was to take the offer and move on. His voice was calm and reasonable, and it made the hair on the back of her neck rise. She went back to the documents that evening and looked more carefully at the hand-drawn map. In the lower right corner, written in faint pencil, she had initially mistaken for a smudge, were 2 words and a surname, Farmland Development Group. She typed it into her browser. The company had dissolved in 1994, but its listed principals included a name she recognized, a name that appeared in the county's current business registry under a different company, still operating, still acquiring land on the northern edge of town. Someone had known about this easement for decades, and now they knew that she knew. She locked her doors that night for the first time in years. Gerald had recognized the map's reference points before Joanne had. 2 of the marked locations corresponded to landmarks that no longer existed. A mill house demolished in 1962, a drainage culvert rerouted in the 80s, but Gerald knew what they had been and where they had stood. On a grey Wednesday morning, the 2 of them drove out together with printed county surveys spread across the dashboard and Biscuit watching from the back seat with calm authority. The second location was a narrow strip of land behind the old feed supply building on the county's Western Service Road. Nobody had developed it. Nobody had needed to. It had simply sat there, unremarkable, for decades. They found the second container 18 inches down, wrapped in the same oilcloth, sealed with the same deliberate care. Inside was a single document. A notarized deed dated 1971, predating the official land registry by several years. It established the water access easement in explicit legal terms, named the rights holder, and bore 3 witness signatures alongside a notary stamp that Gerald confirmed, with quiet certainty, was completely legitimate. Joanne sat in the car for a long time after that. That evening, she called a property rights attorney named Susan Hale, who had been recommended by Gerald as someone who understood historical land claims and wasn't easily intimidated. Susan listened without interrupting. When Joanne finished, there was a brief silence. Then Susan said that if the documents were authentic, and from everything Joanne had described, she believed they were, the value attached to those easement rights was not small. She used the word significant. She said it twice. It was Susan who suggested reading the letters again, more slowly this time, now that they understood what they were looking for. Joanne had read them twice already, but had focused on the legal language, the names, the dates. She hadn't read them as what they actually were. She sat down with them on a Sunday evening, Biscuit at her feet, the kitchen quiet. She read the first letter all the way through without stopping. Then she set it down and pressed both hands flat on the table. Dorothy had known, not stumbled upon it, not inherited the knowledge. Passively, she had known for years, had understood exactly what lay beneath that narrow strip of rocky soil, and had made a choice about what to do with that knowledge. The letters were careful and precise in the way that people write when they are aware that words outlast them. Dorothy had documented everything: the easement, the suppression, the name behind it, and her own reasons for staying silent for so long, which came down, simply and painfully, to fear. But she had not destroyed the proof. She had preserved it, and she had placed it in the one location she could legally transfer to the one person she trusted completely. She couldn't name Joanne as the primary heir without triggering a contested dispute that would have swallowed everything in legal fees and family warfare. So she had done the only thing she could. She had given her the smallest plot, the one nobody would fight over, the one nobody would look twice at, because it held everything. The last letter ended with 3 sentences that Joanne read 4 times before she could see them clearly through the blur. "I could not tell you directly. I needed you to find it yourself. I always knew you would." The legal challenge came within 3 weeks of Susan filing the initial claim. 2 parties. The developer, operating now under the name Crestfield Land Group, and Russell, her cousin, who had apparently retained his own attorney sometime before he made that casual, reasonable phone call, suggesting she simply let it go. Joanne noted that detail and said nothing about it. The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, the pressure arrived in the forms that pressure usually takes. More letters, more offers, a phone call from Russell's attorney that Susan intercepted and handled without bothering Joanne about until afterward. The developer's side filed a motion questioning the authenticity of the 1971 deed. It was a delay tactic, Susan said. Standard practice. It was also exhausting. There were 3 nights during the 4th week when Joanne sat at her kitchen table and seriously considered taking the settlement number that had quietly doubled since the first offer. Not because she doubted Dorothy, because she was tired in a way that sleep wasn't fixing, and the hearing felt very far away, and she was, at the end of it, still just a woman who managed dental appointments for a living. It was Biscuit who led her back to the original container. She had kept it on the shelf above her washing machine. He sat beneath it one evening and stared up at it with the same locked focus he'd had on that cold morning 3 months ago. Joanne reached up and lifted it down, pressed flat against the interior base. Beneath a false cardboard lining she had never thought to check was one final envelope, notarized, dated the same day as Dorothy's will, addressed, in Dorothy's handwriting, to Joanne Teller specifically. Susan read it the following morning and called back within the hour. "They have nothing," she said. "This is over." The hearing lasted less than a morning. Susan presented the notarized letter alongside the 1971 deed and the archival evidence Gerald had compiled documenting the deliberate removal of the easement from the county registry. The developer's legal team had built their case on the assumption that the original documentation no longer existed. It was a reasonable assumption. It had simply been wrong. The ruling came 12 days later in the form of a brief official document that Joanne read 3 times at her kitchen table before folding it carefully and setting it beside her coffee cup. The easement rights were confirmed as valid and legally transferred. The water access claim attached to the northern boundary plot was hers. Crestfield Land Group's motion was dismissed. Russell's challenge was withdrawn quietly, without explanation, 2 days before the ruling was even issued. Nobody called to congratulate her. Nobody from the family reached out at all. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that this didn't bother her the way she might have expected. Justice, she had learned, didn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it came in the form of a dry legal document and a phone call from an attorney who said well done in a tone that meant it. That Saturday morning, she drove out to the plot with Biscuit riding in the back seat, his nose pressed against the window, exactly as it had been the very first time. She stood in the middle of the land and looked at it properly. Maybe for the first time. The soil was still hard, the weeds were still there, but it was hers. Completely, legally, undeniably hers. She didn't build anything on it. Not that year, and not the next. She cleared it properly, turned the soil where she could, planted a few things along the southern edge that took hold slowly and without much encouragement. She came out on Saturday mornings the way she always had, coffee going cold in the cup holder, Biscuit inspecting the fence line with his usual professional seriousness. The routine hadn't changed. Only what it meant had changed. She thought about Dorothy often out there. Not with grief exactly, but with something quieter and more complicated. The particular feeling of understanding someone more fully after they are gone than you ever managed while they were present. Dorothy had trusted her with something she couldn't speak aloud, had wrapped it in humiliation and rocky soil and the one form of inheritance nobody would think to question or covet. She had known Joanne would be patient enough to stay, known she wouldn't sell in anger or walk away in embarrassment, had trusted, across the distance of death, that the right person would eventually kneel beside the right hole in the ground. Biscuit wandered over and sat beside her boot, looking out at nothing in particular. Joanne rested her hand on his head. Some gifts, she had come to understand, could not be given openly. They had to be buried in the one place no one else wanted, and left for the only person who would think to look. Joanne never gave up on the smallest piece of land anyone had ever tried to embarrass her with. And because of one stubborn dog and one extraordinary woman who trusted her completely, everything changed. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe. There are more stories like this one waiting for you. And drop a comment below. Would you have kept that land?